environmental design perspective and from a statistical analysis perspective. It's simple. If you have a predetermined outcome in mind, it's very little to prevent the unethical person from cherry picking and manipulating their way to the outcome that was preconceived.
Okay, welcome to this latest episode of the Elevate podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined in person by Nick Hudson here in London. Now, Nick may be familiar to our audience. He's featured 3 times on the Pandemic podcast prior to launching the Elevate podcast. And this is our opportunity today to take an elevated view on what's been happening over the last couple of years and look at some of the depth of some of the trends and the undercurrents that have underpinned what we've witnessed over the last couple of years, examining some of the political factors, the economic factors, some of the socio-cultural elements, the technological elements, the legal and ethical elements, to take that level of depth of understanding so that we go beyond the debate around the minutiae of the policy issues and the pharmaceutical issues to actually start to understand what's driven this, what's underpinning it, and what can we do in order to move forward. So, Nick, it's a real pleasure to have you here on the Elevate podcast.
What a pleasure to be actually face to face and not zooming across the miles, eh?
Indeed. Yeah. Now, for those who aren't familiar with you, you're the chair of PANDA.
Chairman of PANDA by night, private equity investor by day, and scallywag the rest of the time.
Yes.
But, I have been very busy the last 2 years. PANDA, Pandemics Data and Analytics, was set up in April of 2020. We've been going hard at it, pushing back against this insane policy response on all aspects. It's not only about the data and the science, there's also as you said, the entire analysis of the political and cultural milieu that propelled this lunacy all around the world in this highly coordinated fashion.
And where did this begin? With PANDA, did you publish an initial paper? Was it an initial piece of analysis that started this?
Yes, there was an escalating informal discussion among like-minded individuals as we were sort of finding each other and realizing that we weren't the only ones with these concerns. And then very quickly, late April, early May, we published a paper called Quantifying the Years of Life Lost to Lockdown, which made the simple point that we were heading straight into lockdown without any form of cost-benefit analysis having been performed. And that was the beginning of the journey. And from there, we proceeded to analyze all aspects of the pandemic and the policy response, and in a very multidisciplinary and thorough way. Numerous articles and appearances in media, interviews and podcasts and so on over the course of the next 2 years. The process of internationalizing the organization. Those are the main headlines. And now we find ourselves much more concentrating on those socio-political issues with a sense that we've kind of wrapped up the analysis. Yes, there will be ongoing retrospectives from a data and epidemiological and medical perspective. That'll be ongoing for years, but for the most part, we kind of know what happened and what went wrong and what was true and what was not true. And it's time now to roll up the sleeves and get to grips with the much more complex and harder to analyze political kind of setting for this whole story and its implications for all of our futures.
Yes. Now, before we get into some of that discussion, you met initially with like-minded people, and I, for myself, found that hard at the beginning to find those people.
Yes, we all did.
And now PANDA has been prolific in its output, both in terms of reports, articles, data sets, scientific analysis. From those initial like minds, could you tell us a little bit about how you've grown, the types of support that you've had, and some of the academics and professionals that have locked arms with you over this last couple of years?
Yeah, look, I mean, the thing we emphasized from the start was the complexity of the phenomenon that we were grappling with, and the importance of bringing a multidisciplinary approach. So we were not at all of the mindset of trust the experts, trust those particular experts. They must be medical, they must be epidemiological, they must be virological. We brought in people from a wide variety of scientific fields in addition to those three, and indeed from a wide variety of humanities fields. And that served us well, because it's very helpful, for example, to have an ecologist on board who can talk about the interrelationship between viruses and humans and the rest of the animal world. And that forces questions into the room. And you get that very vibrant, very mobile world of conjecture and criticism emerging, and that is the only way to create new knowledge. And so I think we did a good job of sticking to that approach. Unfortunately, I would say the majority of the academic voices and some of the voices from the corporate world were people who are unable to be formal or open members of PANDA, and their involvement remained cryptic throughout, and that persists because of this environment of cancel culture and smearing and censorship. It's one of the saddest aspects of all of this, is that there are very few people in the academic or corporate world who are truly independent and able to speak their minds without suffering severe consequences if they trip any of the wires in the narrative structure. So it's part of the whole removal of dignity from human beings, is to force them to toe the lines with extreme falsehoods.
Yes,
and mortifyingly embarrassing for somebody who knows the truth to have to be either performatively or in speech acts complying, going along with what is essentially a lie or a complex of lies.
What's been your experience of that in PANDA in terms of how your published material has been received, first of all, but I'll talk more about how these things have been suppressed. How has your published work been received by seasoned, credentialed individuals, the media?
But if you took all of the responses seriously, you'd become mentally deranged, because there's a huge range of response. There were people who immediately said, yes, that's right, that's what I've been hoping somebody would say, or that's what I was thinking and you've put it into words, or they're very complimentary. And the interesting thing is, as the organization grew and our profile grew, I began to find that in public people would approach me. And initially I was quite disconcerted by that, because my perception, looking at the media responses, was that there were far more people who were critical than complimentary. But over the course of sort of almost 2 years of having some kind of public profile and being spotted a lot in public and approached by people a lot in public, maybe hundreds or thousands of times in the last 2 years, I've yet to have a person approach me and say, you, Nick Hudson, are a terrible person and what you're doing is wrong. That is, I get those comments, but only behind the veil of anonymized accounts on social media and occasionally genuine accounts. But people don't seem to be either sufficiently courageous or to have sufficient levels of conviction about their own beliefs to actually come and have a conversation in public. And so what I encounter amongst members of the general public is an incredible warmth. It can take me 10 or 15 minutes to make it to my table at a restaurant sometimes, because there's just this outpouring of support and very, very emotional kind of resonance that people have with not only what we're saying, but how we're saying it. And that's really edifying, but it makes you think. It's almost as if the media is projecting a temperature of society, a read on the temperature of society that is just completely wrong, in itself a fabrication, and that underneath behind the thin veneer of the soapbox commentators and social media is a much broader base of people who are deeply skeptical about what has happened and very supportive of what we have to say, and have managed to access it despite all the censorship and smearing. And that's quite something. And I have this optimism that at some point that will reach critical mass and do so on a scale sufficient to significantly shift direction in the direction of travel of global policies and philosophies.
Yes, it's my hope that we will see that. And you and I, PANDA, and one of our brands, Question Everything, we worked together on the Lockdown Summit last year.
Yes, wonderful event that.
A fantastic event, really proud of that. But we experienced the same. There were some key individuals that we would love to have spoken on the stage to convey some of the issues that we've been looking at, including some of the political elements that we'll touch upon in a moment. But they too would not put themselves on the platform. They wouldn't even enable us to use their name as a footnote in the credits because of the very reasons you've articulated. The fear of consequence, the loss of funding, loss of reputation because it's going against the tide. However, do you see any green shoots of hope here institutionally? Are you starting to see people to buck that trend? Is there an immediate hope for us here in this way?
Yes. Yesterday, I had lunch with an academic who has been a very key member of PANDA for a long time. It was my first face-to-face meeting with him. And it was a hugely important meeting for me because something dawned on me that I'd perhaps had drifting around in the back of my head, but I hadn't really put into words. I think what we have as a very real issue is a lot of academics and corporate people find their day-to-day work absolutely soul-destroying. They are, all of them, to some degree, depressed, finding it difficult to get out of bed and be motivated by the work that they're doing at their respective institutions. And so when I floated the boat of saying, well, if I could offer you some reasonable fraction of your existing remuneration for a limited term, couple of years, no guarantees thereafter because who knows what happens, but would you take that as a reasonable risk? And the answer was yes. Of course I would, because the eyes lighting up immediately at the prospect of coming into an institution where questioning minds and people who actively engage in the world of open conjecture and criticism and creative thinking are not only permitted but welcomed, celebrated. That idea, which is surely at the heart of anybody who claims to be intellectually engaged in whatever domain, that's what it means to be in that kind of role. So you could see almost in advance the restoration of a sense of meaning and purpose before anything had been formalized. So my sense is that there are a lot of good people in all sorts of institutions who are desperately sad and will move. They will move. They have now understood that the monetary trade-off for integrity is actually a very high one. They would be prepared to swallow quite a lot of reduction maybe in on their standards of living and their financial security in order to maintain their integrity and to re-access a sense of meaning and purpose. Now that is a hugely positive thing. That is manna from heaven for me. It means that I begin to see the possibility for PANDA becoming an organization that reinvigorates that which the universities have killed, or at least turned into a shattered carcass, really. Because what passes now for academic discourse at the universities is shameful. It's insipid, morally torpid, just desperately sad stuff. That this grant hamster wheel and highly gate-kept research, almost compulsory bias introduction in all sorts of scientific research and humanities research. You literally can't stray. Your results are not allowed to be certain things. You're not allowed certain outcomes, so they're forced into producing and manipulating work with incredible bias. And we've seen some quite honest reflections of that. I'll never forget reading that European CDC on the CDC meta-study on masks, cloth masks. And they were quite open about it. They said the vast majority of the studies that they had looked at exhibited signs of extensive bias. It's quite something. So you can see science being rigged, and it's easy to rig science, both from an experimental design perspective and from a statistical analysis perspective. It's simple. If you have a predetermined outcome in mind, it's very little to prevent the unethical person from cherry picking and manipulating their way to the outcome that was preconceived.
Yes, and that's before you add in the corporate interest, the sources, the funding, the group dynamics, the human element, the incentives.
Yeah.
Just by virtue of the concoction of the study itself can skew the results into whatever direction you wish to see.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting observation, Nick, because there is plenty of data to back that up prior to the pandemic about job satisfaction. Certainly in the UK, we've got record levels, and job-related anxiety, depression. It's like a ticking time bomb.
David Graeber's book, Bullshit Jobs, is despite the subject matter being incredibly sad, is a delightful read. It's almost hysterically funny because it's so accurate. And I remember from my days in the corporate world often just looking around at people and saying, how do you do this every day? Do you not stop to think about what this is doing to your soul, to your concept of yourself? And the meaninglessness of so much of the activity, especially when it comes to those endless meetings and committees and risk management processes and safety-oriented stuff, and all the mumbo-jumbo about diversity and inclusivity and the massive amount of wheel spinning that goes on around those issues, never generating anything that makes the world a better place, but actually making it very awkward and inconvenient for a lot of people, and diverting attention away from substantive and meaningful issues. And that, I think, is descriptive of a huge range of organizations, both in terms of organization type and industry and geographic location, but also in terms of scale. This stuff pushes down into the mid-sized corporations, which are rather large in number, and to all sorts of non-governmental organizations and so on. They seem to be wrapped up in a sort of a straitjacket of philosophical boundedness that prevents them from actually contributing anything positive to the world at all. So.
Well, it's a story I resonate with. I spent 8 years in corporate myself and came to that point of dissatisfaction and the complete lack of meaning in my own existence. And it came to my 29th birthday, and I thought, I've got 1 year to turn this around before I enter into a new decade of my life.
Yes.
Now, I made the leap, but it was a leap of faith. I was single at the time. I didn't have a family. But I can imagine for many people making such a leap is quite a risk. The other challenge I found is there was a lack of meaningful alternative. Wherever I looked, it was more of the same. Different industries, more corporate bureaucracy.
Yes.
So I suppose what's exciting from the story you've shared is that now, with PANDA and others, there are now these new organizations that do provide a real alternative.
Yes.
And the visceral experience of the pandemic, because I think finding one's purpose in life is a hard enough journey in itself. But this experience has put so many of us in a position where we've come face to face with precisely what we stand against, culturally, socially, philosophically. And as a result, I think it's lit a fire under a lot of people. So now, when they find that there are organizations like PANDA or Elevate or other groups that are looking to do something different, there's a real hope. Now, the difficulty for all of us is actually going through that transformation from being a grassroots organization that's worked, I know you've done the same, worked largely with volunteers and people who've willingly given their time, to becoming financially secure organizations that can offer those opportunities, where people can do real meaningful work.
Yes, yes.
What do you think the opportunities are for organisations like PANDA moving forward? How do organisations like ours move forward and start to formalise in such a way?
It's a good question, and I like to respond often by almost ducking it, because I'm a firm believer in keeping an eye on the theory of knowledge at all times, making sure that your thinking isn't being distorted by your desires, and so that you're not seeing reality. And one of the core sort of axiomatic things in epistemology is this idea that future knowledge generation is fundamentally unpredictable. If it was predictable, the implication is that you actually have the knowledge now. So if we have an organization that is structured to generate new knowledge, its future will be radically uncertain, and I'm comfortable living with that uncertainty. So I can say that the organization will continue to pay a great deal of attention to building its structure and its way, its tone, very much around the objective of facilitating knowledge generation. And then, having said that, I have to conclude that the forecast contains a huge funnel of doubt and radical uncertainty, by which I mean that to even speak of a funnel is ridiculous. You can't see what it contains at all. And I think that's where we're taking things, is towards this. The things that you want to see. You want to see some the ability to retain institutional knowledge, meaning that people need to have some kind of security over the medium term, that this is where they are and this is where they work. You need to move towards replacing volunteers with permanent people, so that there isn't the situation where as soon as somebody hits a speed bump, whether it's from external or internal pressure, that you find them evaporating and disappearing with all the institutional knowledge that they've created or internalized. So I see that as the future. And part of the knowledge creation will be, the knowledge generation will be around how to bring that to be. And it's okay not to have the answer to every last question. It doesn't mean that you don't have a strategy. Our strategy is to create a rapidly learning organization that's capable of creating new knowledge in a wide variety of fields, including the field that contains the organizational theory itself. So that's where we're going. And this initiative of ours called the PESSL Initiative, you summarized the contents of it. It's, broadly speaking, the socio-political aspects of the pandemic and this general idea of pandemic preparedness and the broader societal context. That project is coming to fruition right now with its first component, and we are investigating alternatives, methods of funding. We've costed the whole thing out, and I think we're getting close to really formally launching that and having underway the exemplary project. Might be worthwhile actually talking about that project a little bit to give your viewers a sense of the type of work that we'll be doing. Inside this whole domain of pandemic preparedness, there are a great many kind of implicit assumptions and so on that need to be made explicit and questioned. So you have your the essence of it is we have a COVID policy response that we've seen that we can look back at now, and we can say, well, does this contradict the state of knowledge at the beginning? What are the elements that are contrary to the hard-won guidelines and principles and constitutional documents of various organizations, the orthodoxies of the field, and to what extent are those notions incompatible with what we've learned since, and how do we flesh out and describe the many ways in which the response contradicted wisdom. That's not a trivial undertaking, because there are so many elements that and you also can't fully answer what was contradicted without answering how. What pressures were brought to bear, what influences, what incentives, and by whom. And very often those questions go back a couple of layers. So it's not a trivial matter of sitting down and saying, well, who done it, or WEF done it, or Klaus Schwab, or Tedros, or Bill Gates, or Fauci. This business of sort of trying to pin the causality on one grand narrative is itself a fundamental epistemological blunder. So you want to see the project in the full richness of its reality, and allocate the resources appropriately. And I think PANDA will produce the seminal work on analyzing what went wrong and how. And we will staff that properly with brilliant people from relevant fields and some tangential fields. And we will put together the documents that become the reference point, the go-to point for people who are activists, people who are launching legal suits, people who are trying to work out better ways of doing things and come up with new policy prescriptions. That's the kind of direction of travel for PANDA. That's where we're going. And it's a very exciting kind of juncture when you're at the point of putting together the phasing of that kind of project, looking at the questions big and small, staffing the project, working out the type of person that you want, their background and character and personality, how you're going to go about assembling the vast research resources that are required to support that kind of investigation. How do you test the ideas and think of ways to challenge your own explanations that you're generating? So it's hugely exciting. I'm really very enthusiastic to roll up my own sleeves and start helping that project along. I think I'm going to need to reassess how much time I spend on some other things, because I do really want to commit to it, and I enjoy everything else. That's a problem, isn't it? But yes. Yeah, so that's where we're going.
Yes. Now, PANDA, myself, others, we've spent a couple of years looking at what I call the propositional level, examining policy, implications of policy, getting into the nuances and nitty-gritty of every piece of legislation, every piece of the science. And I think, as you stated, we've been able to see some pretty clear conclusions, but it takes me to this Dunning-Kruger curve, where now over the edge of that hump, we're in it's complicated, or it's complex zone, which yes, I think speaks into the work that you're doing now, because you're right, we've examined what's happened and how it's happened. Yes. People are speculating who's behind it, yes, and that often leads to why did this happen.
Yes.
And what I think we've initially witnessed, both to the answer to the who and the why questions, is a very much oversimplistic analysis of how things have happened and why. What I'm excited about your project is hopefully it'll start to understand beneath the hood somewhat to get a grips of what's happened and why, but what's the trajectory, what's the history of this,
yes, and
what's the consequences of following that path.
Yeah, and I think it's a sensible and wise point of departure to straight away acknowledge that, as you say, some of the complexity there is so rich that it will defy analysis for eons. But we can say with certainty that there are elements of planning and political agenda. There are elements of plain old error, cock-up, and there are elements of emergence, and all of them interact. So a brave man who makes the claim that we will get it right, we will just get it less wrong, and over time we create a set of explanations which are subjected to criticism. Some of them will be found wanting, and they will be replaced with better explanations, and understanding will evolve. What I've just described there is the universal approach to knowledge generation, and the only approach to knowledge generation. So we will keep that alive, even if all of the supranationals and universities are falling into the abyss of stasis and regression, really.
Yeah, so to me that's the pursuit of open knowledge, open science. That's something that's been woefully absent, and it's clear to me, looking back over time, is it's not new to the pandemic. This, as you spoke about with your meeting, there's this institutionalized rot, really. It's become an overly linear, academia has become overly linear. It's still almost operating towards the first industrial revolution of the kind of production line mindset. There's been a lack of creativity, innovation, lateral thinking, in my view, from my early assessment. And it seems to me what you're approaching is as a purer form of open science. My question to you then is, how do you prevent falling into the same traps that we've seen elsewhere? Groupthink, how do you challenge your own assessment, your own biases, your own conclusions? How do you intend to role model that real open process?
Well, it's fascinating that you use the term role model, because I think a lot of it is about language. And there again, we may have to generate new language for nurturing the truly expansive, generative organization. For example, and I do this quite regularly, I try to stop people from saying what we know is. Because the reality is, our best explanation for the time being of the events that we've seen is. That creates an entirely different orientation and posture towards the matter at hand, where you are putting forward a strong hypothesis, but you're holding it weakly. You're open to the idea that somewhere out there, somebody else, with certainty, will establish a better explanation, and that you will not fall over yourself clinging to the old one when that happens. So it's in awareness of the psychological and emotional postures that one needs to adopt. It's in the language that you're using. It's in having the discipline of, I hate the term calling people out. It's not about calling them out, but just nudging them a little bit into the track of maintaining the generative mindset. All of these things are crucial, and it's the opposite of what's going on in most institutions, where you have to swim between the flags, where you have to speak within an Overton window, you have to learn a set of statements that you can regurgitate, and by rote learning, because there's no way to get to them logically. That's how you design or the culture that you instill in organizations if you want them to remain the same or go backwards. So yeah, I think I'd love to talk about this for hours, because it's where the rubber hits the road, really. It's if you cannot formulate the internal culture and environment that is conducive to that kind of thinking, then you're lost. You're not going to win the battle. And if you can, I think it's impossible that you don't.
Yes.
win.
So there's a quest for open science, open knowledge generation.
Yeah.
It's my hope that what you do, what you're describing here, I'm as interested in the process as I am the potential outcomes.
Very much so. Yeah.
That could come from here. And this generative process, I think, comes with a need for open source, transparency, so that you can have your assumptions and hypotheses tested and challenged, your conclusions, your process, your methodology. But it's my hope that you document the process along the way in terms of how you're developing this type of organization, because I think there is as much to learn in the way in which you embrace this project as there is the actual project itself. I feel that this could help and spark a wave of new knowledge generation, because PANDA aren't the only organisation.
Not be the only and we will never be the only one, hopefully.
Yes,
not the
otherwise we have to say PANDA becoming the source of all truth, otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely, and never, So yes, I think the process is very interesting, and the one thing that it makes sense to talk about, because as I say, the actual content of the knowledge that's going to be generated is fundamentally unpredictable. So yeah, let's talk to the process, and I think even that process should be open source in a way, and itself critiqued. But I think those things you point to, the transparency, the open source nature of the research projects and so on, that's all very wise stuff. I think there are sometimes sections of work or elements of work that you don't want to put out there because they're sort of in draft form, contain errors, haven't been checked by or cross-checked by people from outside a certain discipline. When things are in that kind of flux, you don't want your documents out there being misinterpreted or containing antimatter, destructive of knowledge creation. So you don't want every single step of the process to be open, but certainly you want more openness and transparency than has been exhibited by governments around the world as they've waltzed around citing data that nobody can check in support of policies that nobody can see as being effective.
Yes. Well, this brings me to another interesting part that I'm just genuinely curious about, Nick. There's been a lot of debate about peer review,
Yes.
and talking about the absence of peer review within the last couple of years. But there's also this distinction that Brett Weinstein made at the weekend at the Better Way conference about reviewed by peers.
Yes,
and one
it's
of your
different from peer review. Yes,
how that's different. Yes. But one of the opening gambits you made is that you pulled together a multidisciplinary group.
Yes,
and I think there is, no matter how you look at peer review, historically we've looked at peer in the terms of category of peers. So if you're a virologist, other virologists.
Another virologist. Yes.
We haven't. Why? Exactly. We haven't had that breadth.
And peer review by invitation only.
Yes.
So I think one of the components here, I will be very surprised if we don't move in the direction of an open source type peer review. Maybe it has something to do. There's an element of blockchain, something that preserves features or elements of content or process over time, and maybe some kind of system of sort of upvoting and downvoting, if you like, the comments and criticisms, and maintaining that in a transparent way. I think that kind of peer review, if that's not in our future, then I'll be surprised and probably disappointed, because I think it would be hugely beneficial to have work exposed to anybody who's prepared to take the time to think about the work critically. I mean, there's many papers that have been published and found their way into journals and past the review boards and so on of those journals are not worth the paper they're printed on. I rather sympathize with John Ioannidis' 2005 article where he said, look, most scientific papers these days are nonsense, not worth the paper they're printed on. And that was 2005, and I think things have deteriorated sharply since then. So almost everything that's published, sometimes I get the feeling, is just garbage. Therefore political, not for epistemological reasons.
Yes, I was having a conversation with another scientist just recently. He said that his initial marker is, in the early stages of the paper, is there a documentable, testable hypothesis? Yeah,
falsifiable hypothesis.
And he said the amount of papers where that is woefully absent from the get-go, he instantly sends it back, regardless of what the rest of the contents of the paper is. If you cannot test the hypothesis, then this is not a scientific paper.
It's maybe worth dwelling on that for a little bit, because I think the old logical positivism, the empiricism still creeps through in a lot of our speech and attitudes towards scientific work, because whilst I understand the sentiment of that scientist or whoever he was, for me it's wrong.
Interesting.
You make a mistake when you think that you are dealing with writing down the truth, because truth has that story of finality around it, and you want to test whether the thing is true. This is not possible. You write down an explanation, and it's a good scientific explanation if it is falsifiable. If you can pick up that paper and see a way, an experiment to perform, some kind of, even if it's only a thought experiment, some kind of internal contradiction to highlight something. If there's a way of falsifying the explanation, a plausible way of falsifying the explanation, then it is a scientific explanation, and therefore good for the purposes of science. But to call it truth and to try and lend it an air of authority or dogma at that point that you've decided that it's true is a fatal thought. We simply regard the best works as our best explanations for the time being, and that distinction, I think, is hugely important. It's a massive failing that it's not taught to scientists generally and to medical professionals, and I would say even to members of the general public in schools, that notion that we're always able to improve on our explanations, and that is everywhere and at all times true, is crucial for me. And when it goes missing, what goes missing along with it is that little candle, the little flame of hope and anticipation of further creativity.
Yes. Now, in fairness to the individual, it was a kind of back of the conference room conversation, and it may be that you're on the same page. But that point of difference, that point of clarification, is a really interesting one.
Yeah, and it's a familiar phrasing that I'm responding to. So yes. I think my guess is you probably nailed it. You remembered it precisely, because that's exactly, people say we are. You hear people saying things like they're interested in control and a narrative and a political agenda. We're interested in the truth. And that's actually making the same mistake as the other side. No, we're interested in engaging with reality to get closer to reality or to the truth, knowing full well that it's a complex world and we can only approach the truth asymptotically. I never quite get there. There's always that scope for the infinite scope for improvement and further knowledge creation. There is no end. The biblical kind of construct, or at least religious construct, of the world without end comes to mind when I think of knowledge and scientific endeavor. And one of the many examples of how beautifully small religious memes encapsulate something deep, something really deep that's axiomatic, fundamental. I think that's one of them, the world without end.
You provoke a thought. There's a gentleman called Professor Donald Hoffman, and I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he speaks into this piece. We're hoping to bring him on the show, actually.
Okay, but yes, vaguely familiar, Dan.
He's done some work on perception of reality, and his... Is
he the guy who covers delusions?
I don't know if he covers delusions, but he speaks into the idea that human beings are hardwired for our perception of reality is based upon our survival as opposed to the perception of truth.
Yeah, for sure. But that itself is an observation.
And he's very clear on that. He makes that very clear, and which is, again, when I hear conversations like that, and why I'm interested to bring him on the show, he also speaks into this space where the unknown, the unknowing, and the unfolding, and the ability to try to find a way to falsify these assertions. The piece I'd like to just draw upon from what you've just shared around something that I think is really important, what we've witnessed in the last couple of years, is we've got this cultural, social, philosophical component to what's happening. How do you apply the kind of methods that you've just shared around scientific process to something that's a lot more abstract? If you're trying to assess, what role, let's say, postmodernism and how it's led to this subjectivism and what role that's played in terms of the culture that we're experiencing right now. How would you distill some of those pieces down into something that's more quantifiable and testable?
I think fundamentally there's no area of knowledge that isn't subject to this ground reality that all creation of knowledge in that field can only proceed by conjecture and criticism. If there are fields that engage with degrees of complexity or phenomena of such complexity that it's not possible for us to perceive crisp falsification given the current state of our knowledge and technology. Well, so be it. That's a challenge. But it's no less the case that there is a possibility of improving our explanations of how things work in fields like psychology and sociology, aesthetics, morality and ethics. We can always improve our explanations of reality and of how various objects and phenomena work. There's no particular privilege for science in that regard. We may demarcate something as scientific if the falsification is patent and readily discernible, and then describe the less discernible ones as being non-science. But I'm not a big fan of that bright line separation. I think it's a little bit theoretical. I see a continuum. There are clearly issues where we are infants from a knowledge point of view, and many thousands of years of thought will be required before we become more scientific about those fields. But that doesn't take away from the idea that there is a grounding in reality in all those fields. So let's look at aesthetics, for example. I would regard the statement that beauty is in the eye of the beholder as a very poor assessment of the state of the world, because the fact that there are such things as famous paintings or famous designers or famous composers and loads who are not would seem to suggest that people have a ready agreement as to Bach being better than Salieri or something like that, or Da Vinci being better than my 15-year-old. So we actually proceed through our lives under the assumption that there is a grounding in reality and in fields like aesthetics or morality and so on. And if we don't, it's very dangerous. If you become a relativist, you can go wrong in more ways than you can count or imagine. And so for me, that that process, I don't engage with the more complex issues with any less hope of being able to improve the explanations. They may come in strange forms. So I heard a brilliant podcast the other day involving Jamie Franklin and James Delingpole, where they were discussing Dostoevsky. And it struck me that they were almost advancing Dostoevsky as a set of explanations for the human condition. And I like that. That's the right way to think about it. So crime and punishment, or the brothers Karamazov. Sorry, I never know how to say that because I've only ever read it. But that those novels are, if you like, extended explanations for all sorts of psychological phenomena. And if I went with my gut, I would say probably better explanations than exist in the explicitly psychological tracts of a Freud or a Jung or
Well, yeah. So I'd like to extract this further into, because you touched upon religion, ethics, morals, some of these stories, and it's often said that the religious texts, the oldest texts, are some of those roadmaps to self-understanding and personal development. But I've also heard you talk about the God-shaped whole. Could you elaborate on what that means in the context of what we've witnessed over the last few years?
Yeah, so I mean, an observation that I've made is that when it comes to secularization in the 20th century and our own, there's a lot of throwing out of babies with bathwater, and for quite shallow reasons, maybe a failure to feel a strong metaphysical conviction with respect to a particular caricature of God or the numinous, the spiritual, whatever. Just a failing to, and the absence of any particular level of conviction around a caricature causes people to throw out an enormous time-honored story, to their immense detriment. The solutions that have evolved over time, there again that word evolution, knowledge generation proceeding only by evolution, the solutions that have evolved over time that address our social realities as our cultural evolution peels away from our biological evolution, are sophisticated and extend into the mists of time, across eons, probably predating even our humanity, reaching back into animalian stages. Some of the time there would be probably distant echoes, but what I'm getting to is that there's a richness in these rules and systems and systems of taboos and admonishments and prescriptions and advice, if you like. In those systems, there is a set of solutions for problems that we've lost sight of, if we ever were actually consciously aware of them at all. And it's the brave man who strips the entire thing away, because what will happen in that process is that all sorts of unintended consequences come about as those prior problems that had been solved quite happily are then revealed, emerge all over again. So I think that the process of secularization left this God-shaped hole, and what I mean by it, well, that's quite a broad and philosophical concept. It's not just a lack of sense of the divine, whether in the universe or in humans and our fellow man or whatever, but it's an absence of the set of the words, the ideas that teach us a proper orientation to ourselves, to each other, and to society. That's the God-shaped hole, and into the God-shaped hole comes all sorts of cults and cult leaders and notions and memes that have not been manufactured out of an evolutionary process, that do not embed knowledge, and they're tempting. They're like the silver baubles, the tinsel. They have an allure, especially to a person who's has some a deep sense of alienation and a lack of orientation. There's the temptation to fall for the cult that doesn't embed knowledge, and I think it's above all other issues that we confront, the biggest problem is that God-shaped hole, and we've just been through an event that demonstrates exactly how severe problems can get when we tear ourselves away from time-honored cultural groundings. It's not to say that any particular system, one or the other, is uniformly and in all ways and times and places better than another. That would be a very arrogant type of assertion, but it just recognizes that we're far more likely to find useful knowledge in traditions and cultural memes that have withstood the test of time and are found in flourishing societies. That's kind of where my thinking goes. It's always, because it's complex, it's continually developing thinking. I hope to be argued with and improve my way of expressing it, and find people who express it much better. That's kind of the summary, in a nutshell story.
Well, I suppose the next question would be naturally that follows that is that Professor Matthias Desmet has talked about the social anxieties,
exactly,
the lack of meaning and purpose, social discontent, lack of social cohesion, and people that have followed on from Matthias have talked about, they may not use the term God-shaped hole, but they've spoken about this kind of post-enlightenment phase where we've seen a disconnect between science and religion, and this void
Yes.
that's been left in the way that you've
that sense of
described.
meaninglessness and purposelessness.
Yes. Will this form part of your analysis within the personal component?
I don't know. It'll certainly. I'll certainly be thinking about it. So I guess the answer then is yes. But it might not be formally written down as a part. I'm not running the project. But that what's striking for me, I don't believe that anybody's really done a very good job of describing exactly what we mean when we talk about a sense of meaning and purpose. And I ruminate on that quite often. And one of the things that strikes me is that I personally find it closely related to curiosity, to a sense of engagement with the world, being out there, trying to understand, trying to move your own miserable and pathetic understanding forward. That to me is when I see people who do that, you always get the sense that there's a profound meaning and purpose to them. And it doesn't need to be in an academic domain. It can be in a wide variety of things, learning how to be a parent or learning how to run a society or something like that. It's those people who are curious about what they engage with and engaged with the work that have that sense of meaning and purpose. And the word work, I think, is important, closely allied to vocation. So we can sort of, when you have regard for the concepts of meaning and purpose in that kind of feel, that kind of orientation, I think you get closer to the truth, and I think Desmet and others are hitting the nail on the head when they point to that pervasive alienation, that there's that sense that people experience the whole and the lack of purpose and meaning, and they try to fill it with some false idol. And there are many who describe consumerism and this sort of a relentless accumulation of goods and fashions as a useless attempt to fill the hole, pile in more t-shirts and handbags, and maybe the hole will feel a little smaller, that kind of idea. But of course it's useless if you think about it from the construct of, well, does that t-shirt, that handbag, cause you to be more curious about the world, to be more engaged with the world? Well, then good luck on your journey for meaning and purpose. So yeah, I see it that way. The thing that gives me the twinkle in the eye is curiosity.
Yes, yeah. To me, it's this deep sense of awe.
Yes.
It's wonder and curiosity. All of these things to me that lights something for me. Yeah. I think it would be remiss, Nick, if this isn't included in your project, because I think it's so fundamental. But I understand the complexities of it. You go from the mechanistic piece of understanding policy to some of the scientific analysis, to then these kind of deeper political economic pieces, to then even deeper into philosophy, human condition. But ultimately, I think these are where some of the answers lie. But I recognize the complexity of tackling some of these issues. I would like to close by asking you, because we discussed prior to this interview, have you seen any semblance of solution through your early analysis through PESTLE? And actually, I think we agreed this is emerging and there's a lot of work to be done. But actually, I think some of the solutions you've described in detail today, in fact, the process itself, embracing this new way of knowledge, it's not even necessarily a new way of knowledge generation. It's reclaiming some of that knowledge generation process. To me, that is in part the solution. The way in which you're embracing this is part of the solution. But I'd like to flip the equation. By day, you've potentially been known as an actuary in the past, looking at risk. What do you think some of the risks are now, not only for your own projects, but for those who've been taking a critical look at what's been going on? Because, we've seen things labeled as conspiracy, but we've also seen real conspiracy. We've seen fundamentalism. We've seen nihilism. We've seen this idea of the truth without material support for the truth. What do you foresee? And this cultish behavior you've talked upon. What do you think are some of the risks in order to that could prevent us from actually finding a way forward from this? And what do you see as some of the ways to mitigate some of those risks?
Well, I think the way forward will be slower to the extent that we make any of the errors that the other side is making. The kind of the attempt to access a unitary philosophy or policy, some kind of dogmatic, edificial worldview, that tries to spell out something and stand in opposition to another. So for example, I think one of the fundamental errors of judgment and logic and wisdom of the globalists is their adherence to the false doctrine of utilitarianism. This idea that you can measure and make decisions in accordance with a greater good under that measure. That's a truly horrifically bad, philosophically bad, practically bad perspective. And what I sometimes hear, the opposition, the skeptics, saying things that sound to me awfully like, well, look, we see your spreadsheet for controlling society, for managing society, for social engineering, but we've got a better one, But they're still left with the same error. They're still being utilitarian, just with a different measure and so on. And that actually highlights the problem with utility as a theory, utility theory. But it's a trap. You're not improving things. And we see the World Health Organization, your top-down hierarchical structure, and we don't like it, so we're going to form one of our own. That also is going to be something that nobody should like. And so I don't think we need to be trapped in thinking we need some symmetry of opposition to what we're fighting against. And I think so. I know that's a very, very high level answer, but don't assume that you need to adopt the organizing principles or techniques or processes of the thing that you're fighting. And don't allow yourself to become too dogmatic. I hear dogmatism emerging, and I experience backlash when I challenge it. For example, I've said numerous times, I think one of the problems with assessing the efficacy of treatments, whether we're talking about early treatment or these mRNA therapies or whatever, one of the problems with assessing efficacy is that COVID, the disease, is not dangerous enough to do that practically. You need such large sample sizes because it's not deadly enough. And so what I'm really saying there is I am never approaching any level of grand conviction around efficacy or safety for that matter, because there isn't enough data to do robust statistical and scientific analysis of those things. So for me, I'm prepared to entertain the idea that early treatment may have been something that saved lives, but I'm also prepared to entertain the idea that we'll never have enough data to prove that it was or is. And instead I would call upon people to rest upon an ethical argument rather than on the statistical one, and to say, look, in principle, we want doctors to be able to make decisions, to have agency, not to be constrained by some top-down hierarchical body with respect to their own patients. That the doctor-patient relationship should be honored, held as sacrosanct, is a kind of ethical construct, a meme in society that I believe is one we should uphold, and rather make that the point. So it was wrong to ban whatever substance or to try and smear it because it constituted an intervention in the doctor-patient relationship, not because we were banning an effective thing. That seems to me to be a kind of dangerous route to go down, the second one, because it suggests that, well, if the substance that was smeared or it turns out not to have been effective, then the intervention in the doctor-patient relationship was appropriate, and I don't think that's true. So that's the kind of thing I try to shine the light on all the time, is to, when I hear people becoming too doctrinaire, too dogmatic, too stentorian, I try to step in and just say, careful, you're starting to sound like the CDC or Anthony Fauci yourself, you know.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Well, I'd like to draw up 2 final points in conclusion then. So you mentioned this piece around symmetries, the risk of creating more of the same, just in a different direction. But is there also a risk that we could just try and flip the page, mirror? So if we go from centralization to decentralization, utilitarian to a different form of a different economic
to
theory,
value-based or
value-based.
Yeah.
Is there a risk that we just, because I know there's a community called Game B, and what they've done is identified the problems with Game A, which is the legacy systems that we're facing. But a lot of that is then they're literally taking the mirror approach, the course correct, and it may actually help create some course correction. But to me, I can just imagine the swing of a pendulum, that it eventually will create a new set of problems in the other direction.
Sure.
Is that also a risk? And again, how do we mitigate against that particular problem?
Well, I think my answer will sound standard to you, and it is standard for a good reason. You know, you make sure that you embed conjecture and criticism ideas into all of your innovations. So, and you don't try and make wholesale innovations. You try and make innovations on the margin, rolling things back for a set of recent changes that were not subject to conjecture and criticism. No problem. Right, get rid of those innovations that were launched by these crazy utilitarians who thought they could socially engineer the world. So by all means, delete those recent changes, even going back 50 years, for all I care. But once you get back to that previous stop point, if you like, stopping point, you then need to proceed with the creativity and humility of conjecture and criticism, looking at what happens when you make a change on the margin, introduce an innovation on the margin in some complex system. Be alive to the fact that you're no cleverer than the guy before, and your change, although it may come from a good place and be full of all sorts of wonderful and deep thinking, may actually be destructive and may actually have an unintended consequence that neither you nor anybody else around you foresaw. That's the kind of right process to adopt. The fact that it fails, the fact that it takes us backwards, is no reflection on you. It's a reflection on the complexity of the world, and it's necessary to keep an eye on that at all times, to adopt the posture of epistemic humility. Otherwise you fall into the traps of many traps, psychological traps of confirmation bias and rationalization and so on, willful blindness, and into ethical traps where you perpetuate systems that are harmful and destroy the means of error correction by your own postures and attitudes.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, this leads me to my very final question.
Yeah.
That epistemic humility that you
Yes.
reference.
Yes.
I want to speak on an individual level. You're one of the probably less than a handful of the people in the last people I've got to know the last couple of years, so I can rely to be that rock in the river, who's not swayed by the crowd, the group dynamics, the group think, which can actually compromise some of that epistemic humility. How have you managed to stay grounded? People know you as an eloquent speaker. You've got depth, but also breadth in terms of understanding some of the complexities. But you have humility and a level of being humble around what you know and what you don't know. How do you stay grounded? Are there practices or rituals that you follow that keep you grounded in that way? Because we've seen other people get taken away with the tide, falling into the dogma, falling into the fundamentalism. How do you personally remain grounded?
Well, I go to other people to test ideas, and what I'm actively looking for is disagreement, and then that becomes a little conversation to mine for greater perspective and depth of understanding. That's a kind of reflexive behavior for me. I'm forever picking up the phone on a complete sort of whim to just say, what do you think about this? Or so-and-so said that to me, and I'm not sure that it feels right, but I can't tell you why. Help me, And so I do a lot of that kind of behavior. And then I also stay away from fads and I have quite a broad definition of what constitutes a fad. So almost everything written in the last decade will be a fad. There will be gems that will survive the test of time, but it's very hard to see which they are in advance. And so I tend to go back to older writing. I even become a little bit careful with recent intermediations of old authors, because they put a spin on things that an interpretation that can take you further away from the sort of reality content of the original writers. So I'm a great believer in that. I refer to it as the not canonical literature and the older time-honored writings, and a real effort to stay away from the propaganda, the commercials, the recent stuff, the faddish books that shoot up onto the #1 bestseller lists and then people are forgotten about 2 years later. There's no point reading that stuff. So those are my own personal disciplines, along with a regular diet of exercise. That's about it. The rest are probably for anybody looking in from the outside, the life would probably look pretty ordinary, and more than that I can't say.
Thank you, Nick. Very useful to hear, and there's a huge amount of respect for what you're doing. I think this is actually probably one of the most important interviews that we've done so far on the Elevate podcast.
We'll see if the audience agrees.
In closing, I'm sure people will be curious. We've started to reach a new audience of the Elevate podcast. They'll be curious where to find out more about your work. I know you've personally experienced some of the challenges we've discussed today in terms of censorship. Where are you sharing your writings right now? Where can people access PANDA? What's the best way for people to find out more about Nick Hudson and the work of PANDA?
The website, which is www.pandata.org, is the place to start. And that's really opens up the whole universe of social media and partner organizations and so on. So that's the go-to place I would send people to. As for my own personal reflections, since I was suspended on Twitter, there's no real place where I'm actively engaging, and that's deliberate. I wanted to have a little gap and some time for reflection, get through this trip, which has involved meeting so many people. It's kind of really a cathartic event, and then reassess how that was all going to flow. Maybe I don't need one anymore. Maybe it's just the interviews and more time to reflect rather than being on the treadmill of having to pump out social media posts, So we'll see. I'll have to decide where to go.
Thank you, Nick. It's been a real pleasure. Great to be with you in person for our interview here on the Elevate podcast. So you've been watching the Elevate podcast here today with me and Dan Astin-Gregory and Nick Hudson. Great to finally have an in-person interview here on the Elevate podcast. If you've enjoyed this conversation, I encourage you please to hit the share button. This is, to me, as I said, it's been one of the most profound and important conversations we've had. And actually, where people are looking for solutions, I think the seed of the solution has been found in this conversation today. So I encourage you to share this conversation. And please go to danastingregory.com/podcast to join our mailing list to find out about future conversations just like this one and the projects and initiatives that we're currently supporting. So I want to thank you for tuning in, engaging in this conversation, and thank you again to Nick here on the Elevate podcast.
Thanks, Dan.